What was it like when you first found out about having Alzheimer's?
Like most people, you think that Alzheimer's is an old person's disease. You don't think that people that young can be affected by it, but I've met people in their 40s.
When you first got told it was Alzheimer's, what did that feel like?
I was all right, I think, but the world totally changed.
Trish and Jerry have been married for almost 30 years, despite an unlikely start.
When I first met Trish, she didn't like me. I was a bodybuilder and a bouncer and a kissogram.
He had nothing on apart from like a leopard print thong, I think he would describe it. He completely loved himself, and I thought, yeah, you're not really for me. He kind of chased me back and forth for a wee while, and he's a nice guy.
The King's family home has 4 bedrooms, an open-plan kitchen diner and a living room. Managing their full house has become harder since a life-changing diagnosis.
At the age of 55, I was diagnosed with young-onset Alzheimer's disease.
At the age that he was, you never expect it's going to be dementia.
Kieran, you seen the TV remote?
He picks things up and he puts things, and we're not allowed to move anything.
Where would he have put it?
I know what everything is. Well, I maybe don't remember a few hours later, but yeah.
Trish, there is so much sentimental stuff that I keep packing away.
You have kids and you sort of try and keep on top of everything. And then since his diagnosis, I don't know what to throw out because I don't know what he's going to need to prompt a memory.
We won't let go of anything that you feel is going to bring happiness to Gerald.
Aye.
We've taken as much advice as possible from experts because with Jerry's diagnosis, we know that he might struggle to make decisions really quickly. So we're just going to go at his pace. We're going to follow his lead and just be completely led by him.
When do you think you last sat at the table together?
A good maybe year, a couple of years.
How have you found living in the house as it is?
It's been quite difficult, actually.
Yeah.
Because my dementia affects my visual awareness. Can't judge distances, and there's so much junk. I've fallen over a few times.
Okay.
I do attempt to try and make tea,
Yeah.
but the last attempt was a coffee chicken casserole.
What is coffee chicken casserole?
Instead of using gravy granules, I used coffee granules. And I didn't realise until I was actually serving it up.
Oh my
And
gosh.
it was disgusting. It was It's not just my memory, it's all my abilities I've lost, or I'm losing. If anything was being done in the house or the garden, it was me that would do it. Any heavy lifting, I would be right in there. No problems whatsoever. Now I'm lucky if I can lift a knife and fork. Like again, it's been very frustrating.
I hate that it's got like this, and I hate that I've let it get like this. This is all down to me. This is my fault. I should be able to have a nice house. It shouldn't be hard. I just need to do better. I just feel like a failure.
You're not a failure.
To be fair. No, I am.
This is
Awful.
not failing. This is a really difficult situation to manage on an emotional level, let alone a physical level.
Oh my God!
No. How does that all fit in the house?
Welcome home.
Out of the 350 boxes unpacked from the King's home, we counted 1,296 greetings cards, 762 knickknacks, and 106 electronic instruction manuals. And amateur artist Jerry has a job to do in the stationery section.
How many pens do we need?
Just a couple, really.
3 brand new packs of pencils.
That's
Which one do you
ridiculous,
prefer?
We'll keep that one.
When did you get into art?
Primary school.
Yeah.
I wanted to be a cartoonist, actually, when I left.
So is that how you ended up in architecture?
Yeah, because there was still something to do with drawing again, which is what I loved.
Oh, I
So,
love
yeah,
that.
brilliant,
So you've
yeah.
got to turn your passion into your job.
Yeah,
So have you drawn everything here?
I have, yes. Yep.
Wow.
I think it's very important to be involved in things like art, poetry, writing, things like that. It keeps my brain stimulated. I'm convinced it slows down the progress of the Alzheimer's. I would love to leave it as a kind of a legacy for my wife and my children, so they can remember me for who I was, not who I'm going to be.
What's this one?
This is a poem that I wrote for Trish.
Has Trish ever heard it?
No.
You should tell her it.
Babes,
Yes.
want to come over, mate?
Oh, okay.
This is a wee poem.
So romantic.
I cup your heart as if my own, to carry you wherever I go. There's no place I'd rather be than here with you, just with me.
Aw.
Unfold your wings, my angel on earth. Embrace me with the warmth of your love. My own sweet angel, sent from high, to comfort me when I stumble and cry. There you go.
Aw.
How was that? All right.
Oh, that's lovely. It was beautiful. Yeah, it can be a little romantic sometimes, I think.
What do you do for your anniversary?
I sing to her every year.
What do you sing?
Darling, happy anniversary. Another year of love has gone by.
I think I'll know when he doesn't sing that I've lost him.
Oh.
That'll be when I know he's gone. Gerald is the most amazing husband. He's not perfect, neither am I. And I think that's why we work. Our relationship's definitely changed. Definitely changed. As things progress, I'm sure he'll forget who I am. I mean, you just never know. With dementia, I mean, he could wake up tomorrow and not know who we are. You just don't know. And I feel sad, I think, sad for him. And sad for me, but sad for him.
After 2 long days at the warehouse, the family have managed to reduce a massive 2/3 of their belongings.
Jerry told Dilly that photos really help him with his memory. So hopefully he'll always remember this process.
Oh, look at that.
I mean, it's not my best work,
No, it's
but
amazing.
I'm giving it a good go.
They're going to love this, all these memories. I love this family.
I love this family too.
7 days ago, the King's front door opened into a makeshift and crowded utility area.
Wow!
Now it's an inviting space with sleek storage and hidden functions.
How fantastic!
Just a week ago, the surfaces in the open plan living area were covered and unusable. Now it's been decluttered and organised.
There's storage!
Oh,
That's unreal.
Jerry, this is all full of your arts and crafts.
This looks unreal.
Do you recognise the door?
Yes, I do. Yes, that's a poem. Oh, yeah.
We got a local artist to copy your poem
Brilliant.
that you wrote. Inside here is your Sort Your Life Out scrapbook.
Oh, that's nice.
Brilliant.
Oh, this is fantastic.
Yeah, it's been such an amazing experience.
Honestly, thank you so much for this.
Oh,
This
Yes.
is perfect.
Yeah, brilliant. Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely perfect.
Oh, I hope it makes you feel happy
Oh,
forever,
absolutely.
Jerry.
Yeah, definitely.
Definitely.
Thank you very much.
What an incredible family. What a week. It's been such a big week.
I've got a wee poem that I wrote.
Yes, Jerry.
Stacey, Dilly, Ewan and Rob have been busy on the job. Our trust we gave, they had free range. Just 7 days to make the change. To our family home so full of stress by removing a lifetime of clutter and mess. So now we can't wait to reap the reward. With Stacey and Dilly, we struck a right chord. And Ewan and Rob were free to roam to help turn our house into a home. And we'll never forget all that you have done, except maybe me, the demented one. So, thank you so much, guys.
Love it.
No. Thank you.
Bring it in, guys.
We're going to miss you so much.
With you guys.